Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here for this webinar on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the Australian economy. To those of you who are joining us from Hong Kong or Singapore or places in those time zones, good morning to you. And to anyone who's watching a recording of this, perhaps you're in Europe or North America or Latin America, and obviously don't want to be up at some ungodly hour of the morning, well, thank you for watching this whenever you're watching it. I'm now going to share my screen so that you can see the slides that I intend to work through. Before I go on to the substance of the presentation, however, let me stress, as I always do, that nothing that you're about to hear in this webinar constitutes investment advice, and it shouldn't be construed as such. If you think I've given you an investment tip, then you almost certainly haven't understood what I've said. And before you make any investment decisions, you should consult with your own personal financial advisor who understands your personal circumstances, and you should see anything I'm saying today as being very much of a general nature rather than specific to your personal circumstances. Just turning now, as we draw to a close, to a look at the path ahead. A lot of people have been saying since this downturn began that although we'd have a sharp downturn, we'd also have a V-shaped recovery. I've never bought that argument. I've always said that the path out of the current downturn will be more gradual than the path into it was. And one of the reasons for saying that is that the social distancing requirements that governments have imposed aren't going to be removed all at once, but are instead going to be relaxed gradually, as, for example, we've most recently seen the Victorian Premier announcing. And we know that some restrictions, particularly those on international tourism, are going to be retained until well into 2021. And of course, those restrictions can be reimposed in response to new outbreaks, again, as we've seen in Victoria. We know that having a COVID-safe work plan, as state governments are requiring businesses to do, is making it very difficult and in some cases completely uneconomic for businesses to go back to operating in the way that they were before the pandemic hit. And in a point which I think a lot of the business groups who are advocating for the early removal of restrictions on what businesses can do, or the opening of state borders, don't seem to pick up, is that even when restrictions are removed, people are likely to observe voluntarily various forms of social distancing, even though they're not legally required to. Or if they live in Victoria, they aren't running the risk of being spotted by secret police vans and having heavy fines imposed on them, as Victorian governments love to do. They're still going to observe various forms of social distancing. You can see that in Sweden, for example, where people are not doing many of the things that people are not doing in other countries, even though in Sweden they're still allowed to do them. But again, one of those helpful ABS surveys that I mentioned before, this time a survey of households, says that even outside of Victoria, where some of these precautions aren't mandatory, Australians are still continuing to keep a distance from other people, as 90% of Australians are doing, or avoiding large social gatherings, as 80% of Australians are doing, or avoiding public transport or public spaces and events. And people are telling the ABS that they're continuing to take a wide range of precautions, even in states other than Victoria where these aren't required to be done. They're also telling the Stats Bureau that although they might feel more comfortable about going back to work or sending their kids to school or seeing a doctor in person, they will remain very wary about using public transport or getting on a plane or going to a large social or public gathering. And they're telling the ABS that the only thing that will make them less hesitant to do any of those things is some combination of significantly lower daily infection rates or the development of a vaccine. And I think realistically, the development of a vaccine is still 6 months away at a minimum. We don't know what proportion of the population is going to take the vaccine when it becomes available. There appear, sadly, to be more crazy anti-vaxxers around than there used to be. And we don't know whether a vaccine will actually work in the way that it's intended to provide lasting or permanent immunity from the disease. So there are still a lot of risks on that front that I think mitigate against a rapid recovery. In addition to all of that, many businesses won't survive the shutdown period, so their employees won't have jobs to go back to. Many of those which do survive, including some very large ones, won't immediately return, if they do at all, to pre-outbreak levels of employment. So employment isn't going to come back quickly, and those people who do go back to work in many cases won't be working the hours they were working before the pandemic hit. So their incomes are going to be lower. And that means that the recovery in household spending will be gradual as well. And while there are some households who've been able to save more during the pandemic, as we saw before, and they can draw down on those savings to support their spending, even if their income hasn't recovered as quickly as they would have liked, there are other households who've run down some of their savings, withdrawn some of their superannuation, and they might want to rebuild them, especially if they're planning to retire within the next 10 years. And if you want to put more into superannuation, then you obviously can't spend the same amount of money, and that'll weigh on the recovery in spending. Those households who've deferred repayments of their mortgages for the last 6 months will face higher repayments or repayments over a longer period when they start repaying again. And that'll obviously constrain their spending to some extent. And if, as some forecasters have been suggesting, we do actually see bigger falls in property prices when the property market does eventually reopen in full, then there'll probably be some so-called negative wealth effects on people's spending, as we saw during the period between early 2017 and mid-2019, when property prices were falling in Sydney, Melbourne, Perth and Darwin in particular, and to a lesser extent in some other parts of the country. Another consideration is that although the government has extended JobKeeper and JobSeeker to the end of March, the level of payments under those two schemes will step down at the beginning of each of the December and March quarters. That's a tightening of fiscal policy, and all else being equal, it will detract from the rate of economic growth. I've already mentioned that the tourism sector will probably remain closed to international visitors until the middle of next year, with perhaps some exceptions like New Zealand and some Pacific Islands, Taiwan, Japan and Singapore. But our major sources of tourists, particularly the United States, we won't be welcoming Americans for some time. I would have thought probably not until a vaccine is widely available and shown to be effective. And then, as I mentioned before, but it's worth reiterating again here, businesses are likely to be very hesitant about investment spending for an extended period until the economic outlook becomes clearer. From a longer term perspective, our nearly 30-year run of growth without consecutive quarters of negative growth without a recession that just recently came to an end owed a lot to three factors that I don't think are going to be there in the period immediately ahead. The most important of those was rapid population growth. Over the 20 years to 2020, Australia's population grew at an average rate of 1.6% per annum. That's almost a full percentage point above the average for the OECD club of advanced economies. And most of that, of course, was because of our relatively high immigration intake. Well, there isn't going to be an immigration intake at least until the middle of next year. And even assuming that we do start to welcome migrants again in the second half of next year, if the unemployment rate is still high, if there are still quite a lot of Australians who haven't been able to go back to work, then I doubt that the Australian government will be willing to allow upwards of 200,000 people to start calling Australia home as they did before the pandemic struck. And what that will, of course, expose is that even when our overall growth rates were relatively high, our per capita economic growth rates were actually pretty ordinary. Indeed, over the last 10 years, in per capita terms, Australia's economic growth was actually less than the average for the OECD as a whole. And if it hadn't been for our above average population growth, we would have had at least one and possibly two recessions during the period since the beginning of the 1990s when we last officially had one. The second thing that materially assisted our economic growth during the previous 30 years, but won't be there in future, is our economic relationship with China. In a way that wasn't true for most other Western economies, who, like China, are importers of commodities and exporters of manufactured goods, we derived an extraordinary boost to our national income from our ability to sell commodities to China at very high prices, and also from our ability to import from China manufactured goods at much lower prices than we'd imported them from other countries in the past or made them ourselves. And one of the results of that is that we are now more dependent on China as an export market than almost any other emerging or developed country in our region or indeed in the world. And for that matter, we're also very dependent on China as a source of imports by comparison with other countries. We're one of the very few countries in the Western world, or indeed in the emerging world, who runs a trade surplus with China. Most countries run deficits with China, just as we're one of the very few countries that runs a trade deficit with the United States, which may be one reason why we're just about the only ally of the United States that President Trump hasn't dissed in some way, as he has loyal allies like South Korea, Japan, and Germany or the UK, to pick a couple of examples. Now, as I say, that's worked well for us. But given the deterioration in our economic and political relationships with China over the past year, it almost certainly won't work as well for us in the years ahead as it has done over the past 2 or 3 decades. I should say in passing that while I'm not at all defending what I think China's overreaction to some of the things that Australian governments and ministers have done or said, we aren't exactly Snow White when it comes to imposing trade restrictions. Although we're about the 16th biggest economy in the world, have been the 5th biggest user of anti-dumping measures in the last 5 years. That is, restrictions on imports, because we think people have the temerity to sell us goods at prices below their cost of production. You know, we're not opposed to that if Australian businesses do it, but somehow we think it's awful if a foreign business wants to sell us something on the cheap. And as it happens, more of those actions have been directed against China than against any other country. So, as I say, I'm certainly not defending China's actions in, for example, black banning our barley or our beef or our wine because we've said something about the origins of the virus that has made China think we've offended the feelings of the Chinese people. We're not complete innocents when it comes to imposing discriminatory trade measures, and we shouldn't be completely surprised when our major trading partner decides to do the same thing to us. The third thing that materially assisted our economic performance over the last 30 years, which I don't think will be there, indeed I hope won't be there in the same way in the years immediately ahead, is the property price boom and the escalation of household debt that both caused it and was a consequence of it. We, as everyone knows, have some of the most expensive real estate in the world, in our big cities in particular, and we also have some of the world's highest levels of household debt. And I just think it's incomprehensible that we could continue adding to that, or indeed that we would want to continue adding to that in order to make our property prices even less affordable to young Australians than they are at the moment. So we'll be more than usually dependent on the fourth thing that helped us achieve 30 years almost without a recession, which was good economic policy. Now, some of that was good monetary policy, and there's not much scope for monetary policy to support economic growth in the years ahead, given how low interest rates are. We could certainly use good fiscal policy to help support economic growth. And while, as I said before, I'm not sure bringing forward income tax cuts are the most effective way to do that, I think we'll probably get at least some positive developments on that front. But what we really need to see in order to underwrite a sustainable recovery in Australia's economy is more structural reforms of the sort that will boost productivity over the longer term. We used to be quite good at that. Between the early 90s recession and the onset of the global financial crisis, more than half of the increase in Australia's real GDP came from productivity growth, and slightly less than half of it came from increases in labour inputs, that is, more people working or more people working more hours. But in the 5 years between the end of the mining boom in about 2014 and the onset of the COVID pandemic, barely more than a quarter of Australia's economic growth came from productivity growth, And almost 3/4 of it simply came from more Australians working more hours. Now, that's not going to lay the foundation for a sustainable economic recovery in the future. And what we need to find is ways of boosting productivity growth, not in the way that we boosted it in the 1990s through privatisation or deregulation, because apart from anything else, and putting to one side the fact that some privatisations didn't work and some deregulation didn't work and had to be re-regulated again, there simply isn't much left to privatise, and there's not a lot of markets left to deregulate. Rather, we need a different sort of productivity agenda that, for example, focuses on areas that were exempt from productivity enhancing reforms in the 1990s and early 2000s, which includes important parts of the services sector. And I would also say that productivity growth in Australia isn't going to be enhanced if we continue to fool ourselves with things that aren't true, such as the notion that small business is the engine room of the economy. Despite what people like to think, it isn't. It is true that small business employs a bit over 40% of the private sector employment in Australia, but you know what? 12 years ago, it employed more than 50%. Small business has actually been a net job destroyer over the last 12 years, and over that period, all of the jobs created in Australia's private sector were created by middle-sized or big firms. And even in the period since 2014-15, when small businesses have had an instant asset write-off that's not available to big businesses, and when small businesses have paid 5 percentage points less by way of company income tax than big business, small businesses only accounted for 13% of the increase in employment growth over that period, whereas 87% of the increase in employment has actually come from businesses that haven't benefited from either of these two tax breaks. Nor is it true that small business is more likely to be innovative than big business or medium-sized business. In fact, ABS figures show that small business is less likely to introduce new products or to engage in any kind of innovative business activity than medium-sized businesses or big ones. Instead of preferencing small businesses, in my view, what we ought to be doing is preferencing preferencing new businesses. That is, businesses that are startups or have been founded in the last 3 or 4 years. And I think there are 3 or 4 reasons for doing that. One is that new businesses are more likely to be founded in industries that have a sustainable long-term future than small ones, which more often than not are actually been in the same industry for generations of their proprietors. The second thing is that new businesses are more likely to create jobs. And thirdly, new businesses are more likely to engage in innovation. Indeed, the most common reason for setting up a new business is to produce and bring to market a new product or service, or to produce some product in a new and innovative way. Whereas small businesses, as I've said, are less likely than medium-sized or big ones to innovate. The fourth reason is that new businesses can't help becoming old businesses with the effluxion of time unless they go out of business altogether, in which case, of course, the concessions, you don't give them any concessions. By contrast, we know that small businesses tend to stop growing at just below the threshold at which they cease to be defined as a small business and hence eligible for concessions. There are going to be fewer new businesses at any point in time than there will be small businesses, so the concessions won't cost as much either, or you can make them more generous. And so, while it's not a complete solution, I would say if we want to achieve higher levels of productivity, if we want to have more jobs created, then what we should be looking at is preferencing new businesses rather than simply preferencing small businesses just because they're small. And to reiterate, however fervently people believe it, it's simply not true that small business is the so-called engine room of the economy. And I say that despite running a small business myself. Thank you very much for being here. You can view a recording of this presentation or revisit the slides by logging on to saul-eslake.com. I want to thank Rati Laher, my website manager who's in Germany at the moment, for helping to put this presentation together. Couldn't have done it without you, Rati. thank you for being here, and look forward to seeing you at another one of these webinars next month, when on the 7th of October, we'll be having a look at the delayed 2020-21 Australian federal budget to be brought down by Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, or later in the month, I forget the exact date, I think it's the 28th of October, we'll be having a preview of the US presidential election. And we'll be foreshadowing more webinars on this website later on, so please do visit the site as often as you think it's necessary. Thank you again for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day and appreciate your support.